Can Zadie Smith write about a Bangladeshi guy? Can Arthur Golden write from the perspective of a Japanese geisha? Can Jeanine Cummins write the story of a Mexican immigrant? I'm currently writing a novel from the perspective of a Central Asian dog who's used as a diplomatic tool. But am I even allowed to?
So you have people who now increasingly think that you cannot write about experiences that you have not personally had. And I think that's terrible.
To insist on authors only writing about people just like themselves would be to eliminate fiction and leave only memoir.
Are young people murdering fiction because they're too sensitive to handle it? At first, this idea was easy to dismiss, either as hyperbole in the case of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie,
We've lost the ability to laugh.
or as the ravings of a right-wing troll like author Lionel Shriver, who first warned us that identity politics would destroy fiction in her 2016 keynote address at the Brisbane Writers' Festival. She finished that speech wearing a sombrero, and while she later said, "There is nothing overtly offensive about wearing a straw hat that keeps out the sun," she was wearing the hat indoors, with the brim pushed up like a Renaissance halo. Shriver was using prop comedy to own the sensitive left, which made me think this whole who can write whose stories debate was just another tired front in these idiotic culture wars. But Shriver and Adichie aren't the only authors worried about the fate of the novel. Imagine you write a novel and then 10,000 people take to the streets of Islamabad burning effigies of you. And then the leader of Iran calls on every member of the world's second largest religion to murder you because you wrote a novel. Your book's Japanese translator is killed, others are attacked, you go into hiding, and then almost 40 years later during a book reading, a man nearly succeeds in killing you, blinding you in one eye and stabbing you 15 times because you wrote a novel. Here's Salman Rushdie speaking to The Guardian in 2023.
But there's a kind of uncertainty among young writers about what they're allowed to write about. And not only for political reasons, but also for social and cultural reasons. And I worry about that because my view is that everybody can write about everything. If that's not true, then the art of the novel ceases to exist. The question is whether they do it well or badly, and to my mind, that's the only question. Otherwise, if we're in a world where only women can write about women, and only people from India can write about people from India, and only straight people can write about straight people, then that's the death of the art. The whole point about the novel is that you invent the world that is not, and that includes inventing people who are not like yourself. If all you can do is invent people who are like yourself, then that's nothing.
I had a computer do his voice, but those are Rushdie's words. It's a beautiful vision, a platonic ideal of novel writing, where any person can write anything and they may do it poorly, but how can they do it brilliantly if they don't try? And this platonic ideal would be a reality except for, publishing. See, there are only so many spots on the bookshelf, so to speak. People can only buy and read so many books. So when a novel like The Help lounges on the New York Times bestseller list for several weeks, wait, it was 100 weeks. My God, that's like 2 years. Well, when that happens, it's natural to think, what if instead of a novel about magical Negroes written by a white person, all those readers had read a book by a black novelist? Here's DeRay Mckesson.
They're writers who can inhabit other lives as an intellectual experience, but at a point, I don't want you to write about a gay black man as an intellectual experience. I want to hear somebody who lived it write this story. And this isn't to say that other people cannot, but it is about acknowledging that legacy, that it is only white authors who feel the authority to write about everybody else's culture as if they are the voice.
Rushdie's vision of authorial freedom is deeply appealing, but here's another problem. He says the only question is whether the author writes the character well or badly. But who gets to vote? Take William Styron. He wasn't scared to write across identity. He wrote The Confessions of Nat Turner from the perspective of an enslaved black man, and it won the 1968 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Clearly, Styron pulled it off brilliantly. But here's Nicole from Noteworthy Books.
It wasn't so much that Nat Turner was written in the first person by a white man. It was more that the experiences that he spoke about as a black person were experiences that, as an actual black person, I could not relate to at all.
Despite the Pulitzer win, there was major backlash to the novel when it was released, particularly among black critics.
300 years had passed during which a white man had been on the black man's back. And I may be the only white man, I think, who has for 6 months felt that the entire Negro race was on my back.
Did he just compare the reception of his book to being enslaved? This guy won the Pulitzer? Computer, pull up the 1968 Pulitzer Prize Committee and set it to the music from those old Country Time Lemonade commercials.
Memories of warm nights, golden days.
Let's turn now to a recent novel, and don't worry, things will get much simpler. It's 2019, and the publishing industry has chosen its next big novel. The book is by a little-known author named Jeanine Cummins, who, tired of seeing the dehumanizing media coverage of Mexican immigrants, has written a novel about a boy and his mother escaping Mexico for the U.S. Flatiron Books wins a bidding war, pays Cummins $1 million advance, and launches an Operation Shock and Awe marketing campaign. They'll make certain you can't miss the arrival of American Dirt. The blurbs are stellar. Dawn Winslow compares it to Steinbeck. Stephen King loves it. And it's not just white dudes. Sandra Cisneros says, "It is not simply the great American novel, it's the great novel of Las Americas." And then, the call every novelist except Jonathan Franzen wants to get.
All right, open your boxes. It's Oprah.
This story really opened my heart and changed the way I will see migrants forever.
Cummins knows that, identifying as white and Puerto Rican, she may face criticism for writing a novel that centers Mexican identity, so she comes prepared. She writes an author's note at the back of her book to ward off criticism. She writes,
"I worried that, as a non-migrant and non-Mexican, I had no business writing a book set almost entirely in Mexico, set entirely among migrants. I wished someone slightly browner than me would write it."
She highlights all the research she put into the book, the Mexican Americans who urged her to write it. She even mentions that her husband was once an undocumented immigrant, the fear she felt when the cops pulled them over one night. Jeanine Cummins is prepared. Her book launch will be triumphant.
Just inaccurate, wrong, racist.
And my skin is crawling. My skin is crawling.
Brown folks in the book are paper dolls.
That the book deploys harmful stereotypes.
It's a minstrel show.
A racist novel. It's a poorly written book.
The absolutely wrong, absurd, cartoonish lack of knowledge about us.
The book faced harsh criticism for what some called a stereotypical portrayal of migrant. The publisher eventually canceled the book tour, saying they and the author were receiving threats.
This moment in my life, I can't imagine writing another book again.
Cummins and Flatiron are shocked by the speed and size of the backlash. It isn't just the telenovela plot and stereotypes in the novel that angers people. It's the barbed wire centerpieces at the launch dinner and Cummins retweeting nail art that some mocked as border chic. It's the revelation that Cummins' undocumented husband is from Ireland. It's the 2015 New York Times op-ed she wrote that contained the sentence, "I am white," which leads to accusations that she's rediscovered her Latina identity to use as a shield. It's the phrase, "slightly browner than me," in the author's note. The note itself is a special relic because it's immediately deleted from all future printings. But above all, why did this book get $1 million advance when authors of color are barely getting anything? Why had the extremely white publishing industry anointed this as the breakout book of the year? A protest is organized by a small group of authors, including Miriam Gerba, whose negative review kicked up the tidal wave. The Flatiron and Macmillan publishers meet with these protesters and claim they'll do more to increase Latinx representation among their authors and staff, though they also admit that the tour wasn't canceled because of security threats as they'd previously claimed.
Folks in that room admitted that Cummins had received no death threats.
Among the authors who signed a letter urging Oprah to drop American Dirt as a book club pick is Alexander Chee, author of How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. If you've been in a writing workshop in the last 8 years, there's a good chance that someone, me, emailed the group a link to Chi's Vulture article about writing the other, at least before it got paywalled. In it, he says that most white writers who ask, "Can I write from a POV of someone who doesn't look like me?" don't really want to do the work. They just want permission.
So...
Instead of asking others for a green light, you should, Chi suggests, ask yourself 3 big questions. 1, why do you want to write from this character's point of view? 2, do you read writers from this community currently? 3, why do you want to tell this story? Chi doesn't provide much of a scoring rubric, but that's the point. There is no definitive, if you answer X, you can proceed. Let's see how Jeanine Cummins might have answered these questions. 1, why do you want to write from this character's point of view? Well, Cummins says she tried writing the story from multiple perspectives, including white people near the border, but the novel wasn't working. Early readers only cared about the Mexican mother and especially the son.
He's the only one I care about.
Chi notes that if you're not in community with people like those you want to write about, chances are you're on your way to intruding. And while this isn't one of the big 3 questions that Chi lists in the article, I think it's the most important one. I think it's the fastest way to figuring out whether your story will be well received by the people you're writing about. Was Cummins in community with Mexican immigrants? Kinda?
I went to Mexico, spent time in the borderlands, visited Casas de Migrante, volunteered at a desayunador, interviewed everyone I could think of interviewing.
That's a lot of research, but no, it doesn't seem she was enmeshed in a Mexican immigrant community. Do you read writers from this community? Yeah, she lists them, but I think this is too low a bar. 3, why do you want to tell this story? And here's where it gets bad. According to Miriam Gerba, a publisher's letter came with her advance copy of the novel. The publisher wrote,
"The first time Jeanine and I ever talked on the phone, she said migrants at the Mexican border were being portrayed as a faceless brown mass. She said she wanted to give these people a face.
Mexicans don't need a white person to give them a face or a voice. This spark of the novel smells strongly of white saviorism, which is a bad combo with a 7-figure advance. Giving the voiceless a voice is not a good answer to why do you want to tell this story. But what constitutes a good answer? I mean, the best possible answer I can think of is, I wrote this novel to try to end slavery. And if, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, you wrote a novel that hastened the end of slavery in the United States, that book would be well regarded by black people, right?
I've often wondered, I imagine you have too, how such an important book as Uncle Tom's Cabin, creating a character, Uncle Tom, who Mr. Lincoln said was one of the causes of the Civil War, should ultimately wind up being so despised and hated by the black people. Why did this happen? Miss Stowe certainly had no axe to grind against blacks. She was by no means a racist. Her intention really was to alleviate the conditions of the black men and women in our country. And yet, somehow, ultimately, we came to hate and despise Uncle Tom. There are 2 reasons, and they're relevant to what we're talking about tonight. One is that Uncle Tom, for all of his great values, was given to us and did not grow out of our own experience. We did not create him. He came from someone else. The second point was that Uncle Tom's characteristics were created basically to elicit the sympathy of the white community who had the power to do something about Uncle Tom's condition. This was because Uncle Tom couldn't do it himself.
So personally, I'd get rid of the why do you want to write this story question. I just don't think there's a good answer. Zadie Smith agrees that there's no good answer, but she finds that liberating. In 2016, she told Slate,
"I have absolutely no defense, apart from I love and am curious about other people's lives, and I am explicitly a voyeur. That's why I started writing, because I wanted to know what's it like to be a Jewish Chinese guy, or an old black woman, or a white professor, or whatever."
I like Smith's conception that writing a novel requires both empathy and voyeurism. You need both to imagine the inner life of a stranger. Like, maybe that big yawn is because she was up all night studying, or maybe she was fighting with her boyfriend who just started selling cocaine. Should we not try to imagine the inner life of someone who is different from us? If not, won't we end up writing, as Hernan Diaz says,
literary selfies, you know? It will be confined, confined to the narrow province of your immediate experience. How depressing.
But maybe the big problem with American Dirt wasn't the motivation, it was the execution.
People who tend to write across identity lines just do it very badly. I mean, it's just bad writing. That's why we talk about it. Of course, you can write whatever you want. Who cares? But when you do it badly, yes, we're going to talk bad about you. And when you look at a book like American Dirt, it's a bad book. And that's not subjective. That's an objective truth.
I want to believe this argument so badly, that the author's identity only matters if the book sucks. It means the power to escape these confining rules of representation is based on artistic merit. It means we live in a world where quality matters. It frames this obsession with identity as an aesthetic failure. Does cultural appropriation even really matter if the end result is a work of beauty and truth? I want great writers to be liberated and all others to be careful. I want to live in Roxane Gay's world where identity only matters if the novel is objectively bad, like American Dirt.
Of course, for every person that thought that novel was terrible, there were clearly hundreds of thousands of people who thought it was just wonderful.
Right.
Oprah thought it was wonderful, which, God bless her.
How is Roxane Gay the new Jonathan Franzen, throwing shade on Oprah and believing novels can be objectively bad?
You think there's objective crap?
Yeah.
So if we can't go by popularity, what's this objective way of measuring artistic value? I mean, even Harold Bloom, a man of extraordinary literary elitism, a man who said reading Harry Potter didn't actually count as reading.
Okay, but then what are you saying? I mean, are millions and millions and millions of people wrong?
I'm afraid so.
Even Bloom says that the aesthetic demands deep subjectivity and is beyond the reach of ideology. In other words, no, we cannot come up with an objective scale that rates literature and tells us which novels should be free from accusations of cultural appropriation and misrepresentation, right? Right?
The author Colson Whitehead talks about writing difference, and he just says, don't fuck it up. And I think that really is the best and only and simplest advice.
So how do we make sure that we don't
fuck it up?
Nisi Shawl and Cynthia Ward, in their book Writing the Other, have a chapter called Don't Do This, where they list common pitfalls writers make when writing across identity, especially race. These include dark, invading hordes, the magical Negro, the sidekick, the character who talks with exaggerated dialect. Like, here's Joyce Carol Oates doing a reading at the 2011 New Yorker Festival.
For she be fat lady in the family court place we'd be waiting by the chairs, and some boys say nasty like, yo, that lady so fat, man is she fat.
And hey, I'm no arbiter of authentic African-American vernacular English, but I'm gonna go with... But Joyce Carol Oates doesn't give me the biggest no thanks of that panel. That prize goes to T.C. Boyle. Here's how he kicks off his reading.
So you also wanted some perversion, I guess, right? A little bit of perversion.
I don't think I said that. But
that's how I read the fine line.
Okay, he's going to read us something perverted he wrote, even though that wasn't the assignment.
This takes place in 1795 in West Africa.
What he proceeds to read is the story of Fatima, the daughter of a tribal chief.
Fatima's erotic charms are predicated entirely on a single feature, her bulk. Fatima weighs 382 pounds. As a girl, she was a mere slip of a thing.
Boyle has written the origin story of Fatima's obesity. I'll summarize it with text on screen, but I'm not going to read it out loud.
After that excoriating and traumatic night, she ate. She ate prodigiously, furiously. She couldn't get enough.
He wraps this extremely disturbing story in the velvety blanket of Iowa Writers' Workshop craft techniques. He describes the men's faces as
beatific even.
T.C. Boyle's free to write whatever he wants, but the panel's host, Deborah Treisman, asks an excellent question about the shape of that freedom.
How much of your freedom in that passage had to do with the fact that this was set in a different time, in a different culture, in a different place? And whether you could have written this scene about an 11-year-old girl in California in 2011.
Oh, shucks, Deborah. At this point, I was a student at the University of Iowa, and I didn't have bus fare to Des Moines, let alone go to Africa, so I made it up. It's a literary Africa. It's a cinematic Africa, you know? I'm just having fun riffing on something.
Yeah.
It's a strange defense. He seems to imply that if he had had money for a plane ticket to Africa, he would have written a less troubling story. He also doesn't answer her question because the truth is, no, he wouldn't have written this story about an 11-year-old Californian girl in 2011. The distance in time and identity between Boyle and his subject liberate his imagination and allow him to just have fun writing a story of such trauma. It seems easier for many authors to inflict pain on characters whose identity is different from their own. And look, I'm not trying to cancel T.C. Boyle, I just want his publishing company to give me his next book deal instead of him. So I guess I'm trying to cancel him a little bit. Some white writers, desperate to prove that they're not racist, paint their characters of color with patronizing sentimentality, often casting them as saintly victims. This was a charge leveled against Jeanine Cummins. Miriam Gerba summed it up best when she described American Dirt as trauma porn that wears a social justice fig leaf. But there's another kind of misrepresentation too, the kind where you just miss the mark. Los Angeles Times writer Esmeralda Bermudez had this critique of American Dirt.
In 17 years of journalism, of interviewing thousands of immigrants, I've never come across anyone like American Dirt's main character.
But Zadie Smith doesn't love this test. Smith talks about how novelists writing a POV unlike their own feel this enormous pressure to get it right. That if only they can do enough research to fully understand what it's like to be, say, a Mexican immigrant, only then can they write a correct Mexican immigrant. Smith says this is problematic and, in fact, impossible.
What does it mean, after all, to say a Bengali woman would never say that, or a gay man would never feel that, or a black woman would never do that? How can such things possibly be claimed absolutely, unless we already have some form of fixed caricature in our minds? It is to be noted that the argument a white man would never say that is rarely heard and is almost structurally unimaginable. Why? Because to be such a self is to be afforded all possible human potentialities, not only a circumscribed few.
And yet, as Smith herself points out, just because a character could possibly be real doesn't mean that the character works. For the character to work, the artifice of the novel needs to dissolve away. I stopped reading The Goldfinch, for example, not because a white guy would never say the things the main character was saying, but because I couldn't stop hearing Donna Tartt's voice in the character's dialogue. A novel works when we can imagine the narrative as if it's real. It doesn't work if we can't stop thinking, wow, I'm reading a book full of characters an author invented. As Smith says, novels are machines for falsely generating belief, and they succeed or fail on that basis. It's about being convincing more than it is about being right. Smith understands the impulse to use an author's identity as a kind of shortcut for telling whether a character will be convincing. She says it's natural for us to assume that those who are like us will at least take care with their depictions, but it still bothers her. She wants novels to take us on journeys of self-discovery that we cannot predict into the mystery at the heart of all selfhood. Anyway, even if you nail the representation, there is still the problem of cultural appropriation.
I'm almost never accused of cultural appropriation. Why not? Because I'm brown, and Bengalis are brown, and so it's all the same to white people.
Readers give Smith more leeway to write across identity because she's not white, but Smith resents that, sees it as fake piety. She wants to extend the same benefit to everyone else. Let's define cultural appropriation as the adoption of an element of one culture by members of another culture in a manner perceived as inappropriate. That's an okay starter definition, though it's vague and subjective because we can argue forever about what is or is not appropriate. Lionel Shriver seems to reject the idea that any cultural usage could be inappropriate. She says if white people aren't allowed to write from the perspective of people of color,
non-white people also don't get to listen to Beethoven.
Oh, good, this argument. Let me guess what's next. Shakespeare?
Read Charles Dickens.
Okay, whatever.
Dance to Talking Heads. Or use an iPhone.
This argument is so fucking stupid. It's a bunch of logical fallacies wrapped in the smirk of a racist troll. But also, did she just hold up Talking Heads as an example of undiluted white culture? Talking Heads never get accused of cultural appropriation, even though an African musician can listen to their songs and say, it's African music. Why? They took those Afrobeat influences and produced music no one else in the world was making. This is support for the Roxane Gay argument that artistic excellence is the ultimate shield against accusations of cultural misuse, even if we can't objectively measure excellence. Among the many idiotic things about Shriver's overall point is a failure to see the power dynamic between the hegemonic, unmarked state of so-called white culture and the frequently colonized cultures of people of color. White people have an interest in treating their identity and culture as default. So when Toni Morrison writes about black people, she's writing about race. But when Tolstoy writes about white people, he's writing the human story. Plus, when the cultural output of white people is adopted by others, it's white people and white companies who financially benefit. White culture's invisible elasticity boosts an economy that primarily benefits white people. There's a history of white people decimating other groups literally, economically, spiritually. Culture can feel like the most important thing left. And when white folks start coming for the culture, well, that's pretty different than a black girl learning to play Beethoven. But at least back in 2018, Ottessa Moshfegh doesn't seem to know about that.
If things continue in the way that they are culturally right now, nobody can say shit about my next protagonist because she's a Chinese cross-dresser. You just tried to tell me she's disgusting.
Right.
I mean,
I'm sure there is going to be someone out there who is offended by this, that is an act of cultural appropriation, that how dare an American...
I will say this in advance of that.
Mm-hmm.
I have been appropriating you guys' culture this whole time.
Yes.
Every single fucking book, I'm appropriating white culture.
Yeah, no, it doesn't work like that. But is writing the story of a character from a different culture automatically cultural appropriation? Sort of depends who you ask. But chances are the more money you make from the work, the more accusations you'll get, because it's one thing to imagine the life of a person of another identity group. It's another to make $1 million from it, especially if people from that group aren't getting paid writing their own stories. And that creates a problem for publishing because the goal of the publishing houses is to make money. If American Dirt had been a mid-list book struggling for attention on the bookshelf, Jeanine Cummins doing podcast interviews that attracted 100 listeners, the backlash would have been tiny. Instead, the industry decided, or knew and decided, that this book would be huge, would be bigger than any novel by a Mexican or Mexican-American. A few months after American Dirt hit bookstands, Mexican-born author Silvia Moreno Garcia made the bestseller list with Mexican Gothic. She did not receive a 7-figure advance.
I got a hard time selling almost everything I've ever published. Right after finishing Mexican Gothic, we tried selling Untamed Shore, a noir, and it was basically impossible to move that. We ended up going with a new small press for a very modest advance of a few $100s and a print run of 2,000 copies.
So in the words of Miriam Gerba,
American Dirt is a metaphor for all that's wrong in big lit. Big money pushing big turds into the hands of readers eager to gobble up pity porn.
And this is the sneaky fucked up thing about all this. What many Latinx critics hated most about the book, its simplified misrepresentation of Mexican people, is also probably why the book made so much money. American Dirt paints its characters with a sentimentality and moral simplicity that appeals to a largely white American readership. They don't see the problems implied by that simplification. Publishers want books that will appeal to these mostly white, mostly female readers, and the pressure to write for these readers extends far beyond white authors like Cummins.
I would like us to get to a place where there's less pressure placed on marginalized creators and there's less pressure placed upon representation, where we are not discussing how effectively someone represents an entire identity, and we are reflecting more on what is the quality of the story. We deserve a better level of criticism than thank you for representing us well. We just do.
This is the less discussed flip side of the who can write whose stories debate. When we place such an emphasis on different identities, we put pressure on writers of those identities to write certain kinds of stories. This is definitely nothing new. It's what Percival Everett satirized in Erasure in 2001, later adapted into the film American Fiction. It's a pressure that Toni Morrison always rejected.
I don't have to speak for. I don't represent a group. I'm not, whatever my political, associations are, that's not where I work them out. I don't work them out in literature. Literature for me is something else. It's a free place. It's a very hard place. It's where philosophically things trouble me.
I am especially suspicious of language like stay in your own lane or don't write about experiences that you don't have, etc. When it comes to race and ethnicity and what writers of color are allowed to do, because more often than not, backfires, and instead of opening up our opportunities, it just pigeonholes us into the same kind of ethnic trauma trope novel.
That's Rebecca F. Kwong, author of Yellowface, which tackles cultural appropriation in publishing. She points out that the question we often ask is,
who has the right to tell this story, which I think is inherently nonsensical.
She identifies the real question.
Who's getting paid to tell these stories?
And that's not a debate about writing, it's about publishing.
I'm skeptical and cautious and quite nervous about any framework that puts permissions on what you can write from the outset. After a work is published, anything goes. People have freedom to critique a work however they like, and you live or die by the sword of the market. But when we begin conversations with, oh, you never should have written this in the first place, or you don't have the right identity, you don't have the right qualifications, you're not XYZ enough, I find that incredibly dangerous, because then we start appointing cultural gatekeepers for making these decisions, and nobody's qualified to make those calls.
She's right, except that the publishers are those gatekeepers, whether they want to be or not. They're the ones making the secret calculations about what will get to market and what will get blown up by the lasers from the Sphinx's eyeballs. So Oprah can say,
I fundamentally believe in the right of anyone to use their imagination and their skills to tell stories. If one author, I felt, one artist is silenced, we're all in danger of the same.
But the publishing industry can't publish every book every person writes. They silence more voices than they amplify. That's the job. The industry is adept at hiding in plain sight. They want you to think of a book as a piece of art created by the author whose name is on the front, and not as a mediated commercial product. They de-emphasize themselves so much that you won't even find their name on the front of a book. You'll find their little colophon on the side. The greatest trick the publishing industry pulled was convincing the world it didn't exist. Nowhere was this more evident than on Jeanine Cummins' short-lived book tour. Cummins was asked to answer for things she didn't do.
I didn't call my book a classic, someone else did. I didn't decide how much the auction was going to go for. That happened in the publishing industry.
She was getting grilled on stage while her publishers were at home on the couch. Most of the publishing industry is white people. Attempts to change that have been slow and inconsistent. Yes, many of those white people claim to be actively looking for novels by marginalized writers, but that's not a perfect solution. These predominantly white agents and acquiring editors are the gatekeepers. They are the ones figuring out who gets paid to tell whose stories. They are the ones judging authenticity. And they are the ones who decide if Jeanine Cummins gets another shot. I thought maybe Cummins would go the way of Arthur Golden. Memoirs of a Geisha was a huge commercial and critical success in 1999, but there was backlash and a lawsuit from the geisha he'd used as a source. Golden hasn't published a novel since. But Cummins is not done. In May 2025, Tinder Press will publish Speak to Me of Home, a novel about 3 generations of Puerto Rican women and a storm that devastates the island, much like Hurricane Maria in 2017. Cummins has a Puerto Rican grandmother, and maybe she feels this time it will play out different. But among these comments, we can finally find someone expressing the idea that Rushdie and others warned us of. Unless you were on the island when the storm happened, this is not your story to tell. Unless you understand the PTSD, the anger, the sadness, the suffering, the scar this situation has left in us all firsthand, this is not your story to tell. This sentiment is easier for me to understand when I think about the history of white people profiting from brown and black stories. But I wonder if the reader holds nonfiction to a similar standard. What if Cummins were a journalist writing a nonfiction account of the hurricane and its aftermath? Maybe we want to hold fiction to a higher standard because of its power, the way a novel can make us forget we're reading and make us feel we're there, the way a story can convince us that something the author imagined is true. Fiction is a free place, but it's a hard place.
Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about black people. Anything can happen in art. There are no boundaries there.
But when we start falling down holes of saying you suffered in this precise way, so you get to write this, I find that incredibly dangerous and I think bad for literature overall.
Writers are free to write whatever they wish, but readers are free to criticize them. White authors writing stories that center Black, brown, and Asian characters should be aware that their work can do harm, and they'll hear about it. Not every identity is equally hard to write across. Zadie Smith feels that Anna Karenina, the character, has meant as much to her as any imaginary woman could. She says that women who have read Tolstoy or Flaubert have asked, how could a man know so much of us? I had the same feeling this year when I read Edith Wharton's The Age of Innocence. Wharton writes from the perspective of a man, a flawed, earnest, smart, stupid, deeply relatable man who believes his vivid inner life makes him more of a rebel than he really is. Encountering this character, I felt a shock. Edith Wharton, a century ago, had written a man who felt more real to me than any I'd encountered in fiction. The publishing industry has for far too long heaped rewards on white people imagining the lives of others. We can hold novelists writing across identity to a high standard without forbidding them from trying. This means our most talented authors might defy our expectations, and that they're free to follow the complicated truth of human experience wherever it leads them. This is Below the Fray.